We're talking a lot now, Europe, what does it mean? What do these states mean? What's a good? Is it a good that Piraeus has been bought by the Chinese? Actually, it was bought 5 years ago. Is that a bad? Why is it a bad? If it's a good that there's now a commercial link between Naples and Capodistria at the very top of the Adriatic, which happens to be because the Chinese are in the Mediterranean, and this happens to be a Chinese container ship line. So that is Lee throwing out a very large agenda, and we're going to be continuing working. We'll have as our next speaker Joseph Weiler from New York University. We are looking for his proper interlocutor. We hope that Edmund Phelps would be coming, and then we hope, I'm putting Professor Barricon on the spot, we would like very much to have some focused conversation around Germany in a broader perspective in December, but if it's not then, we certainly will have to have that conversation. This is a school where there's been very, very important study of German history in broad perspective. And then in the spring, we're tending to move some, here, but we're having Peter Gallison talking about questions of energy. We're having Visser speaking about immigration, and we will have another couple of speakers. So each time we're going to kind of a cluster of problems. All that said, let me turn the program over to Charles Maier, who will be speaking first, then Perry, and then we'll have a comment, and then we'll keep things going.
Professor de Grazia asked me to try and apply political economy to the European crisis or difficulties. So there's not much territoriality in this presentation, Vicky, but I set out some points, and strong points, for the sake of discussion and argument. First of all, and concerning Europe at the present point, but in analyzing the state of European affairs today, I think, including obviously its economic difficulties, it isn't sufficient to analyze Europe as an autonomous unit. I think it has to be considered increasingly as a subsystem of global capitalism with some peculiar systemic regional characteristics. And in general, this particular crisis occurs as three major historical changes are underway, and perhaps I could I'll add a fourth. Very, very briefly, Asia is obviously emerging as a set of major economic actors after a 3-century period in which it was eclipsed by Europe. We take this now for granted, but it is a world historical transformation. And probably if I were forced to choose one, that would be it. The United States is clearly entering a period of uncertainty about its capacities and about its role after its brief, exuberant unipolar moment from 1989-90. And so we have a long-term shift in historical equilibrium, and this economic crisis will hasten that shift, no matter how it's resolved, since it tends toward the same displacement. The trends are trends, but they're also one event after another that happen to work in the same direction, or mostly, and I think that's what's happening. The era of so-called neoliberalism, market regulation, seems to be threatened after its 20-year triumph, so to speak, since the collapse of state socialism in 1989-90. But I'm going to suggest that its actual operating premises were misunderstood, and they now stand out as a particular historical formation, which I think it behooves us to analyze. And here comes that word markets, which, like Vicky, I've I sort of wonder, who is a market? I mean, sometimes markets are supposedly the summation of rationality combined, and at other times they seem to be a lemming-like behavior in which imitative behavior rules. So whenever I see the market, I adjourn my judgment on that. But now, the prosperity of the last 30 years, 20, 30 years, was built on a real technological change. We should not gainsay that. It was built on going from the age of steel, let's say, to the age of silicon. Not that steel has not ceased to be hugely important, or industrial sectors are not hugely important. The Chinese in 1970 produced about, I think, 20% of the world's steel output, which was maybe, I forget, 700 million tons. But by 2006, they were producing 45% of a world steel output that had doubled. So there's clearly a lot of hardware in the last 20 years. But at the same time, there is a whole new leading sector, which certainly has transformed my personal life in the way I've worked, and this is important. So Asia's reemerging. I think the United States is clearly in a sense of self-questioning. I don't think it's going to disappear as a major actor, but it's, we talk about decline, and yes, in some ways we are declining. Decline is always relative, so perhaps not absolute. And neoliberalism is in some trouble, but we should look at what it was. Now, the subsystems, I suggested Europe was part of a subsystem of world capitalism. They are no longer just those in which trade complementarities tie together national economies. Traditionally, in the 19th century and up until, I think, let's say the 60s, you could say, one thought of systems as where industrial producers and agricultural producers were linked together in complementarity. One produced hardware and goods and the other commodities, and there was a joint mutual interest and market interest. But this is less the case. There's more, there is differentiation, but what's really these subsystems are regions that develop complementarities today of saving and spending behavior. And related to saving and spending behavior, export potential and import potential. Now, one such subsystem is the one which I looked at in Among Empires when I called the United States an empire of consumption. It's the one that Neil Ferguson has dubbed Chimerica, which is a play on chimera and chimerica. That is the tandem, the duo of the United States and China, whereby China has absorbed a major portion of American sovereign debt and enables the United States to run both large current account deficits, that is import surpluses, crudely put, and at the same time budget deficits as well. So most of the first decade of the century was spent having the Chinese fund much of our budget deficit. In return, China gained a good deal of direct foreign investment, the transplantation of industrial know-how, and a large marketplace for its manufacturers. There's rarely a label you can turn over in a product these days in a big store which doesn't say made in China. For that you have to go to a Mercedes dealer. So this has been a mutually beneficial systemic linkage, I think. Now, I would argue the European Union came to constitute another such subsystem in which strong savers and exporters were yoked together in a complementary relationship with consumers and importers whose spending they have supported. Germany, Greece, etc. Let's give it another fanciful name to match Chimerica. Let's call it Eurotopia. And this is a system which has functioned on the basis of this sort of mutual but different types of advantage that are gained. Now, what's interesting that each of these systems, of course, is regularly denounced in moral terms. for being, in some sense, immoral, offering free goods and encouraging dependency. And they're also said to be unsustainable over the long run. Now, this may be true, but the long run, as Keynes reminded us, can be very, very long. Peter Peterson, as long as I remember, for 4 decades, has said we cannot, the United States is going to face a crash after its, because of its current account profligacy. Will it face difficulties, but it's, in a sense, these relationships have subsisted over decades. Despite predictions, they cannot last. We know in some sense they can't go on forever, but we also know they're not going to end tomorrow. So somewhere between tomorrow and forever is a long time. And the point is that the creditors in the system, the lenders, need the supplicants or the debtors just as the debtors need the creditors. This is what Keynes tried to teach the Americans in 1946. We didn't want to listen then, and we played the moral high card. Now, how does Eurotopia function? I don't have to go over, I won't go over, the notion that it functions imperfectly because a monetary union without a political union, without a common fiscal policy is very difficult. And this has been the experiment underway. But that analysis you get every day, not even in the Financial Times, but New York Times and Boston Globe and most places. So ultimately, I think that mismatch will be resolved. But despite what the Germans say, it functions to a degree as a transfer union. And this is, I think, a good thing. Germany long denied it was going to be an immigration country. Long said, we're not an immigration country. Well, it wasn't an immigration country, but it received more and more immigrants. And there is no way the Eurozone cannot function as a transfer union, given Germany's desire to remain a net saver and exporter, and not only Germany, the heavy lifters in this system are Germany, the Netherlands, I guess Sweden and Finland. These are the virtuous exporters. The others are more or less balanced. And I don't see any reason it cannot remain a transfer union. Now, this runs into political unions. The electorate in Bavaria may not approve of this and may change the balance in the governing coalition, just as the current Tea Party people in the House of Representatives may essentially block the achievement of a type of bipartisan consensus on fiscal policy in the United States. But in theory, politics aside, that's the big aside, I think this system can function as a transfer union. And in any case, whenever you have a union like this, the hegemonic actor, the most powerful, whether political or economic, has to provide public goods to keep the system going. The United States did this in the Marshall Plan era. We were not a transfer union, but we were transferring stuff to keep Europe going into the 1950s. The largest actor has a stake in systemic stability, and so should tends to finance it. It's the price of leadership, and I think that's important. We were the lender of last resort, and we were the consumer of last resort. So in the European Union, moreover, has long functioned as a transfer union. Germany has paid subsidies to French farmers to sustain the common agricultural policy, which has become a major pillar, an essential pillar of the European economic community. And in return, Germany received a market for her industrial goods, as well as protection of her own still significant agricultural producers, and the stability that her leaders understood. I believe they were far-sighted leaders. I think Mrs. Merkel is, she knows what to do. It's hard for her to get there, and she doesn't do it with the same panache that earlier leaders did, but I think she's been pushed. But the Germany's leaders understand this. So that today the Eurozone has provided for the expansion of German and French financial industries especially, since they are agents. They're public utilities, in effect, that advance the funds to the net debtor countries, thereby receiving a de facto commission. So much of this Greek debt, of course, is and Portuguese and others, is being held by German and French banks, and it's for this reason that the prospect of writing down its value, although people argue about this, I personally think ultimately it will have to be written down, even if the terms of repayment are just extended. But in a sense, Germany, this German government and the French government are trying to protect their own banks, and this is where they get into an argument with Mr. Trichet. Now, the banks have been accused of not correctly pricing risk, of being reckless, and indeed many of these banks have been. But in fact, this was a system in which the Eurozone states were supposed to eliminate sovereign wealth risk. They were encouraged, in effect, to be reckless, as our banks were encouraged to be reckless about mortgage lending just a few years ago. Now, this brings me, looking at the mechanism, brings me to the historical dimension in which Eurotopia was created, and the so-called crisis of market liberalism, which has followed the crisis of state socialism a quarter century ago. Very quickly, the triumph of market liberalism was signaled by the election of Margaret Thatcher, then of Ronald Reagan, then the French socialist abandonment of their redistributive program in 1983 to stay in the EMS. Analogous changes took place in Italy. The central bank received its independence, and wage indexation was brought down. And in a sense, this system, what happened in this pivot, this threshold period from the end of the 70s, with electoral disillusion about political efforts to contain inflation, that is political wage bargaining, wage price control boards, etc., etc. What happened was the exponents of market solutions scored a surprising victory. None of us Keynesian economists in the 60s or 70s would have expected this. It seemed just totally impossible in an age of large labor unions. But the labor unions were to be dismantled in part, to be transformed, and we entered this period of what the right tended to call neoliberalism. Well, I don't think that was quite the right term. What happened, if we look at, and I have some numbers, I don't have time really to go into them. What happened was that the social actors, the financial communities, industrial leadership, and the trade unions and others consented to a compression, a tourniqueting of money supplies in the end of the 1980s, public money supplies, end of the 1970s, as the price for ending this debilitating stagflation. But in return, what was less realized was that, in a sense, the whole financial community of each of these countries was given the right to print private money. Credit card expansion, investment going into from commercial banking to investment banking, eventually the keying of interest rates to sustain the equities markets. And we can see that if we look at money aggregates or the financial debt, U.S. debt, that is not the debt banks owed to banks, but the debt to fund activity elsewhere, whether mortgages or industrial expansion, rose tremendously in the 80s. And world foreign direct investment, inwardly directed, rose from, let's say, from about 55 billion in in the mid-80s, all the way up to 1.3 trillion in the 90s. Banking assets grew tremendously. Banking profits grew tremendously. The U.S. banking sector, and this is not so different from the UK banking sector, had been roughly had its assets, and its assets are loans in some sense, a total of about 50% of national income. the assets were about half that amount from 1850 to the mid-60s for over a century. Then they climbed to 100% during the 70s, and then to 250% by the end of the 1980s, and about 550% on the eve of the crash in 2006. And this was by greatly increasing leverage, loans and profits. In other words, we went from a system of public funding of social bargaining in the 70s to a system of vast private credit expansion and paper assets, monetizable asset expansion in this period. Returns on bank equity, on bank stocks, jumped from 10% for about 50 years to about 20%, and then up to 30%. Now, this was a huge unleashing under state auspices in each countries and in the Eurozones and under, in some degree, under the Basel agreements of private credit and monetary asset creation. And it was, what the world woke up to this in 2006 to 8. It woke up to it in relation to the American mortgage market. Now, that's often depicted as a bunch of shiftless people wanting to buy homes that they could not afford. But it was, just as equally, it was the result of banks pushing money into this system, and not only directly into housing, but then derivatives based on these mortgages, which were sliced and diced and sold all over, and then even more so credit default swaps, which are essentially just bets on the outcomes of the way investments will turn out. Now, there were bubbles, there were corrections, the crash of 1987, which was quite drastic, the savings and loan collapse in the United States, the dot-com collapse in the early 2000s, the failure of long-term capital management. But by and large, these were sustained in part because the crises could be laid off on the developing, emerging market world. And Mexico had a major crisis. Thailand had a major crisis. In a sense, this is the way the gold standard had operated before the First World War, although it was often not noted. So underneath these phenomena, there was also a major change in what we could call the regulatory parameters of capitalism. That is, monetary policy, financial policy, tends to, policymakers look at one overriding index to which they orient themselves, like a lighthouse on the horizon. That changes. In the interwar period, it was, and up to the interwar period, it was the gold standard. In other words, you tried to stabilize and run an economy according to if you saw drains of gold or not from your country. This seemed to lead to the great contraction of the 1930s. At the end of World War II, we went to an implicit full employment standard. Policy was run to keep employment up. The left was stronger after World War II in Western Europe. Fascism had collapsed. This worked until 1981. I think under the Bush administration, we actually went toward a sort of implicit equities market standard of regulation. Alan Greenspan would keep the interest rates low enough to sustain the buoyancy of these markets, and then worried about irrational exuberance. It wasn't irrational; it was a response to policies. So this is the system. Now today we look at the ratio of debt to GDP. I'm not saying these are all totemic or false, but they are, we have to look at the implications for them and how they're changed. Now this system is in crisis. I think Europe has an additional reason beyond the United States to worry, and that's its demographic composition, the lack of replacement of active labor force participants by non-labor force participants, and as has Japan. Let me just end with a couple of theoretical reflections. The ground rules of capitalism decompose economic returns into assets or savings and to consumption. In theory, savings exist to facilitate future consumption. But in fact, for those who can save, there are limits to consumption. Keynes noted this. Savers and I mean big savers, save because, and also small savers, they like to save. They accumulate. This is what Marx noticed, what he called the law of Moses and the prophets. I don't believe, I think when regular economics, a Percy can, this may seem tremendously naive to any economist, but the notion of an aggregate consumption, preference for consumption, marginal propensity to consume or to save, they're mathematically related, seems to me a misperception of what happens in the economic world. I think there is no one socially aggregated propensity. There are at least two deeply rooted social preferences which have their political expressions. Those who save because they can, they will, and sometimes because they must, because they just can't consume enough. After you have your $40 million home and your yacht, etc., stuff piles up. They save because they can, they will, or they must, and those who consume because they must, who have little choice. And usually these divide between the left and the right and the left. Although the politics is muddled because many of the social actors, like trade unions and educators, left-wing educators, save through pension funds and the like. Now, in periods of asset repricing or destruction, people wake up that they've consumed a huge amount of stuff which pricing did not let them see. This happened after the World Wars. Vast amounts of physical destruction. In World War I, it had not been priced into the system, and when people woke up to this, it caused rapid currency depreciation. In periods of asset repricing or destruction, the choice has to be to privilege assets and saving or privilege consumption. And consumption is almost always sacrificed because of the central role that accumulative agencies, the savings agencies, have been given. Greek consumption will fall because German and French assets need to be safeguarded. Now, I'm not saying it shouldn't fall, but the crisis operates to do this. Consumers can become systemically threatening only by catastrophic developments, whether through suffering, vast suffering, as in Argentina and other places for a while, or through street theater and violence. Asset managers are systemically threatening all the time because their assets are needed for the circulation of the system. Cohesive classes don't really exist necessarily. Labor wants to defend its accumulated assets and pension funds as well as be able to consume. But the sectors of the economy are created, and I don't have time to develop this, and I'm still trying to think it through, not just by class, but by different attitudes toward intertemporality, toward present and future. An economy maximizes the future or the present. In fact, in a closed economy, one can't live off of one's grandchildren. That's impossible. There are production frontiers in the present. And so to appeal to the future is to give priorities to those institutions that can save at the cost of present consumption, and state socialism did this all the time. And the economy of state-guaranteed asset accumulation, which is what the neoliberal experiment was, state-guaranteed asset accumulation, tried to satisfy both priorities through real growth. It did. It had the benefit of working at a time when we had this great technological revolution, and it tried to give the consuming classes more access to housing as an asset and as a consuming good in the United States, certainly. But the shift in economic power has thrown this into doubt, and the reality of the growth seemed to evaporate. Now, that's where I think we are. Being a creditor is deemed to have a virtuousness that being a debtor does not. And of course, my commentator was stepped in after a government had behaved rather profligately in denying that the future would make a claim. But I'm tempted by the Pirandello quote, or in English, what is it? Right you are if you think you are. I forget the Italian title of the play, but I would say it's rich you are if you think you are, and poor you are if you think you aren't rich. So we come to deeply rooted individual, psychological, and personal attitudes, as well as class behavior. And what I think economics has not really systemically thought through since the days of Wurzel and the Austrians, the ratio, the relationship of the future to the present. Thank you.
So I'm the economist. Thank you, Vicki. The book she was referring to, just in case I forget to mention it, I should say it is the basis of this talk. Although a lot has happened since that was published, even though it was only about 7 months ago that it actually was published. The New Lombard Street from Princeton Press. If you want to look into the background of some of these arguments I'll be making. So I want to think about our title. Europe. Europe is ground zero today. Yesterday, really this week. But the United States was ground zero 4 years ago. I refer, of course, to August 2007 when the US crisis began, followed by the Bear Stearns collapse in March 2008, and then Lehman in September 2008. In my view, that context, that US context, is essential for understanding the current moment in Europe. As I shall relate, there are strong similarities between the two crises. Indeed, I would go so far as to say they're two aspects of a single ongoing crisis, which is playing out differently in Europe than in the US because of different historical and institutional contexts. To begin, I want to draw your attention to the extraordinary actions of two central banks, the Fed and the ECB. And perhaps I'll just say there are many, many close parallels between what I have to say and what you just heard. But one thing I will say a lot about that he didn't say a word about is central banks. Okay? Two central banks, the Fed and the ECB, which have used their own balance sheets to put a floor on the crisis. This I want to sort of emphasize. It was the central banks that have saved the bacon so far. Okay? They won't tell you that because they're not sure that it's legal what they did. But that's what they did. Other central banks have also been involved, the Bank of England, the Swiss National Bank, the Bank of Japan, but leave them aside for the moment, and their time may yet be coming. We'll maybe come to that in discussion. In previous history, only in wartime, and as a support for government war finance, have central banks expanded their balance sheets in the way we've seen in the last 4 years, and it's not over yet. This new role of central banks raises a number of questions which can only be engaged by bringing back political economy. I see 3 lines of inquiry immediately. First, take it as given the legitimacy of extraordinary central bank intervention to support war finance. If you're fighting a war, the central bank is a subunit of the Treasury and end of story. Okay. We've seen that before in both world wars and also farther back than that. But today, where's the war? This time we're apparently saving not democracy or sovereignty or anything of that kind, but rather the financial system and sometimes even individual banks. The central bank is using the tremendous power of its balance sheet, not in its role as government bank, but rather in its role as banker's bank. It's a new thing. Is it a legitimate thing? First thing. Second question. Take it as given that central banks took on this extraordinary role only reluctantly. Perhaps people don't realize that, but yes, central bankers are actually rather conservative figures. They didn't want to do this. Okay? Only reluctantly, and because other more legitimate policy tools and policy actors were frozen. The Fed acted because Congress prevented the Treasury from acting. The ECB acted because there is no European Treasury, and the European Financial Stability Facility, the nearest equivalent, is too small. Put more pointedly, the central banks acted because the political leaders did not. Is that legitimate? And what does it say about the legitimacy of the political leaders? Third point. In taking on this task, central bankers were acting in cooperation with other central banks, and thus, in effect, as supranational actors. It is the global financial system that they were saving, not the national financial system. And yet all central bankers are, at least on paper, subordinate to their domestic political masters. For lack of action by the G7, much less the G20, we got world government by the C5. Okay. The Fed, the Bank of England, the ECB, the Swiss National Bank, and the Bank of Japan, the central banks. How should we think about this emerging, unelected, unaccountable proto-world government? remember, they saved us. So we have a complicated relationship to this. So I've been talking about central banks, and I've hung these 3 points on the role of the central bank, but the broader political economic point touched by each of the 3 concerns the relationship between private finance and the nation state. The central bank having a foot in each of these worlds is a natural focus for this broader concern, but it's only a piece of the larger story. As an illustration of that larger story, I draw your attention to the front page of yesterday's Financial Times. 2 stories in particular, 2 headlines. 1, U.S. tax authorities target bank deals. This is an article about how private finance has facilitated tax avoidance. Barclays, the big banks are all involved in this. Second headline, J.P. Morgan head, that would be Jamie Dimon, lashes out over anti-American bank regulations. This is an article about the clash between Jamie Dimon and Mark Carney, who's governor of the Bank of Canada and the presumptive next head of the Financial Stability Forum, which is the international group of regulators. Both of these headlines are indications of the fraught character of the current relationship between private finance and the nation state. The old system has broken down. The old rules do not hold anymore. So that's by way of provocative introduction. So let me build this argument a bit. At its core, and I think this is where Professor Maier and I agree, maybe, this crisis is really about financial globalization. Both words are important to me. When I say globalization, I do not mean primarily trade in goods and services, but rather the integration of previously national money markets and capital markets. Again, both words are important. Securities markets are increasingly global, as pools of investable capital seek out the highest risk-adjusted return on individual investments, but also on diversified portfolios of investments from around the world. And money markets are also global, as national borrowers who seek more funds than domestic lenders are offering inevitably find what they need in global funding markets, especially dollar funding markets, given the special role of the dollar. Financial globalization in the last 30 years has created the modern world, and it is being tested to the core by the current crisis. Now, previous smaller crises of financial globalization were typically triggered by funding problems narrowly in peripheral nations. Think of Mexico or East Asia. Typically, these involved a combination of currency crisis as well as banking crisis because the lending was in dollars and the currency risk was backstopped in one way or another by the state. Just so, typically, the agent of deliverance from these crises was usually some combination of the IMF and the United States. The closer you were to the United States, the better off you were. One exception, and a key turning point in my view, was the long-term capital management crisis of 1998. Even that was understood by many as simply a consequence of the Russian financial crisis, just another funding problem in a peripheral nation. In retrospect, however, it involved something new. Long-term capital management was a hedge fund doing what was called convergence trades, which meant trading both long and short in global capital markets, and it was funding those trades in global money markets. To my mind, LTCM was the first crisis of the emerging market-based credit system, often called today the shadow banking system. Come to that. I remember that well. That was the fall of 1998. I had just recently finished writing an intellectual biography of Heyman Minsky. You may have heard of. We've been having Minsky moments now. He must be smiling at his grave. And I was teaching the economics of money and banking. So as the crisis unrolled onto the pages of the Financial Times, I found it natural to ask myself, what would Minsky say? And I wrote about it at the time as a test to see if I could inhabit this man who I had written a biography of. And that's how I got started on this road, 1998. The long-term capital management crisis was resolved essentially by wiping out LTCM's equity holders and by forcing its other creditors to take an equity stake. All the while the Fed didn't do any of that, okay? It held the meeting downtown, okay? But the Fed intervened to maintain stability in the domestic dollar money market generally, and that translated into stability of the world dollar money market. It was scary there for a while, but everything held. So far, so good. We got overconfident, thought that's what crises are going to look like in this new world of global financialization. Wrong. In retrospect, long-term capital management was just a little 5.0 warning shock, and today we're in the middle of the 8.0 main event. Unlike LTCM, the current crisis has gone beyond private balance sheets, and it's taking the form of a fiscal crisis of the state. both in the US and in Europe. It's important to appreciate the state was never supposed to be the backstop for the market-based credit system, so-called shadow banking. In the US, the private banking system was supposed to be the backstop, okay? But the Citibank and so forth. But it got overwhelmed, and that's how the state backstop got into the picture. In Europe, by contrast, the state was already in the picture because most of the backed credit was already on the balance sheet of the private banking system. They did shadow banking on their balance sheet, UBS, so forth, Royal Bank of Scotland. In the United States, the underlying securities were household mortgages. In Europe, the underlying securities are sovereign debts. In both instances, a good chunk of the debt was funded short-term in money markets. So when the crisis hit, in both cases, the first approach taken by central banks involved intervention in the money market. This is natural to central bankers. Okay? Ever since Walter Badgett's Lombard Street, 1873, Lombard Street, a description of the London money market, a book, by the way, which everyone can read, okay, and everyone should read, okay, even though it's about the monetary institutions of 19th century Britain, and so it's completely out of date. It's short-term money markets only, but it is essential reading, if only to compare with the present. That's the book where central bankers got their mantra: in a crisis, lend freely against good collateral and at a high rate. And that's what central bankers tried to do when this crisis broke. Both of them, both central banks did. But both soon found out that it wasn't enough. And the problem was that the modern financial system is really much more of a capital market system than a money market system. The problem was with the collateral for this debt, therefore. The collateral, in both cases, long-term debt, quite different from the kind of short-term trade credit that was the focus of Badgett's analysis. Liquidity crisis showed itself not only in a sudden demand for money, which a central bank knew how to deal with, okay, but also in sharp falls of security prices, hence rising haircuts for the securities offered as collateral. The market for secured funding froze up because the lenders of money did not want to risk getting stuck with illiquid security collateral. That's some jargon. Understanding, here's the important point, the important political economic point. Understanding this dynamic, or learning this dynamic in the crisis, both the Fed and the ECB responded by extending their traditional lender of last resort remit to include also what I call dealer of last resort, hence the title of my book. They intervened not only in the money market, but also in the capital market, directly, by buying particular classes of securities whenever their price fell too far below what the central bank considered to be fundamental value. This is, I can't explain enough to you, how traumatic this is, what a deviation this is from what the Fed thinks it should be doing. Okay? It never would have imagined in a million years that it would be buying $1 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities, and yet, in a crisis, that's what it wound up doing. The Fed was slower than the ECB, and it bought mortgage-backed securities. The ECB bought sovereign debt directly, and still is. The point is that central banks became not only bankers' banks, but also dealers' dealers. They moved directly into the capital markets and got completely intermeshed with financial globalization. As we're focusing tonight on political economy, I should emphasize that both the Fed and the ECB were careful about what securities they bought. In the US, the Fed bought mortgage-backed securities. But household mortgages have a long history of special treatment, like Fannie and Freddie in the US, so it could be argued that the Fed was simply building on that history, rather than deviating from its own history. In Europe, similarly, the ECB bought peripheral sovereign bonds. But again, the whole European Union project involves special treatment for its members, so maybe again it could be argued that the ECB was simply building on that history rather than deviating from its own history. What I'm suggesting is that maybe the interventions of the central bank can be justified as an extension of its accepted legitimate role as a government bank. There's a case there. But that case fails to explain why people are so upset. If it's really just Fannie Mae plus, okay, why are people so upset? I think we have to take on board that central banks have been doing something dramatically new. They've been doing war finance to save private finance. And we need to understand what that means for our future. In the US, there are 3 bogeymen that candidates for office reliably trot out to inflame the voters. Big government is one. We hear a lot about that. But also big finance. Americans hate big finance, hate the bankers. And also the big wide world. The right trots out big government, the left trots out big finance, and they both trot out the big wide world. Lending to support big banks was bad enough, but lending to support big European banks was simply beyond the pale. You might remember how Congress raked Ben Bernanke over the coals on that one. And he learned that lesson. That means that Europe is going to be much more on its own as this crisis continues to unroll. The Fed will be unable to help. Last week, Operation Twist is about as much as Ben Bernanke feels he can do in the current political climate. So, suppose Greece defaults, which is looking pretty likely. So what, you say? Greece is not very big. And it's not, actually, in the scheme of things. But the same, you'll remember, was said, though not by me, about the subprime mortgage defaults in the fall of 2007. Larry Summers, for example, said that. There aren't so many of these, it's only $250 billion, forget about it. The problem in both cases is that these assets were not simply owned outright by someone who would just have to absorb the loss. That ownership was also, more often than not, funded by borrowing in world money markets. Thus, trouble in a very small section of world capital markets got transmitted immediately into the general world money market. And fear of looming trouble became itself trouble, since it produces the very contraction of credit that's feared as a consequence of outright default. Debt overhang, deleveraging, and credit contraction are the headwinds preventing growth today. So financial globalization has been the theme of world growth for the last 3 decades. Financial deglobalization could well be the theme of world contraction for the next decade. Those are the stakes. Deleveraging is an enormous headwind, as I said, but behind that headwind is an even more enormous political-economic problem, the shifting relationship between private finance and the nation state.
Thank you very much. Good evening. When I started my studies on economics in 1986, the university where I started to study was called Karl Marx University of Economics in Budapest. And when I finished 5 years later in 91, it was already called Budapest University of Economics. It was the same university, the same building. And the statue of Karl Marx is still there today, which is probably a sort of precaution. In that part of the world, we are used to so many changes, it's not worth sort of throwing out those new things, they may become useful later. And when this crisis hit, there was a lot of debate whether, this is the crisis of capitalism. And having learned my lesson in the late 80s, early 90s, I immediately said to myself, no, wait a moment. We have learned it, we have heard it many times in the late 80s that capitalism is in constant crisis. I think by now we all agree that this is a crisis in capitalism, one of the many that have happened in the past. But the crisis in capitalism, according to one of the Rockefellers, I'm trying to quote all these classics now, is that capitalism was built on trust. And I think in the last decades what we have seen is that the healthy balance between greed and fear, which keeps capitalism more or less under control, has went so far and so long out in the direction of greed that when the pendulum swung back, fear has been driving our life and will be driving for quite a long in the coming years. And that is that loss of trust which is shaking the fundamentals of the economies in Europe and in the United States, and will do for a while. Now, this is the global message of this crisis, but I think this crisis have proven to be a very uninvited and unpleasant guest in every country and every region in the world, and it has been delivering a message to each and every country on a tailor-made basis. And what this crisis has delivered as a tailor-made personal message to the European Union, that the European Union is in crisis because it has been going through a half-hearted, half-considered, half-explained, and half-finished integration This is the crisis of European integration. Europe, the European integration is half finished because Europe is doomed always to make suboptimal decisions when it comes to major decision points. Suboptimal because Europe is working on the principle of the smallest common denominator of now 27 countries. They always try to agree on political points of decision, trying to find a consensus among very different interests of small and large states of different economic and political culture and development. And when they try to make a decision, they run ahead on those issues where they can agree and leave behind those unresolved issues where they cannot agree. And therefore they always come to somewhat suboptimal decisions at a given point of time. And the best example of that is the European Monetary Union. That was a suboptimal decision because with the benefit of a hindsight we can easily say that it's stupid to create a monetary union without a fiscal union. That cannot work long term. And there were many people who said that at the time. But there were many, many positive reasons why European integration had to go ahead, including a fear of a reunited Germany, arguments to create a single market in a more efficient way, etc., etc. And those positive motivations have pushed down those arguments which were announcing early on that the creation of this system is suboptimal and it will not work long term because monetary union cannot work without a fiscal union. But not only at the inception, but ever since, many mistakes were committed. Letting Greece in on the basis of false statistics. France and Germany diluting in 2003 the Maastricht criteria, which weren't very wise anyway, but they were even diluted, watered down. And the whole system was created on the principle which now shows its impossibility, which very often the German position is in this debate, is no exit from the Eurozone, no bailout, because we are not a transfer union, and no default. So where can the steam leave the system? The Eurozone was created as a fair weather alliance of countries without planning for storms. But the storm is always coming. The storm is coming and creating hurricanes in different parts of the system. What started as a bank crisis has become a sovereign crisis of excessive debt and deficits. But there has been a fundamental crisis which was there before, which was European competitiveness on a downward slope, well before the crisis hit us. And all this crisis has shown the incapability or insufficiency of the European governance structures. And all this has now become the crisis of our political union. To a degree, it's a political union, and today what we see is clearly a political crisis. One of my former colleagues, Jean-Claude Juncker, who is not only Prime Minister of Luxembourg, but he's also head of the Eurozone group, has said the key motto of this crisis today, which is we, meaning the European leaders, we all know what we need to do. What we don't know is how to get re-elected if we do what we need to do. And this is symbolizing the problem, and I wouldn't like this to be translated simply as an agency problem of politicians who were elected to serve the public good, but they are rather motivated by their personal interest of getting re-elected. This is not that, or not only that. This is also the difficulty of European leaders to get their very skeptical public to legitimize and accept fundamental shifts and changes in giving up sovereignty. Because what Europe is about is an unprecedented attempt to create synthetically for the federation from historically existing strong identity-based national states. It's an unprecedented trial, experiment, which we don't know whether it will succeed. So this is a political crisis. If you talk about the current situation, there are at least four questions to be raised. One, is there anybody, any country, any leader in Europe in the past 20 years who has not committed mistakes that were leading to this crisis? And the answer is clearly no, everybody was involved in this. Every country has had their fair part, not only those who are the consumers, importers, but also the exporters and savers have made major mistakes. The second question, can we realistically expect German citizens to write a blank check for profligate countries in the indefinite future? You know, there was the famous, I don't know how many of you follow soccer, but there was Gary Lineker, a genius UK striker, who after a game they lost in the quarterfinals of one World Championship said, you know, football is a game where 22 men chase a ball and always the Germans win. This is the Lineker principle. Now what we see today is the revenge of the Lineker principle, because the Eurozone seems to be a football pitch where 27 nations play and always the Germans pick up the bill. And it is quite understandable why German citizens do not want to pay the bill in the indefinite future. So when Minister of Finance, Mr. Schäuble, says we can talk about Eurobonds only after there is a proper fiscal decision-making structure, a strict, prudent fiscal decision-making structure, it's quite understandable why he talks about it. But the third question of political will that we need to raise, or political issue, is can we realistically accept Greek citizens to go into a tunnel where they know for sure that the tunnel has no other exit at the end? Because it is quite obvious for everyone that Greece cannot and will not be able to repay its current level of debt of 150% of GDP with a growth rate of practically zero, potential growth rate of zero. I don't think you can realistically ask people to take unlimited suffering into the future without having at least a beacon of hope at the end of the tunnel. And we have to say, Greece is bankrupt today. Greece has to restructure. Without restructuring, Greece will not be able to cope with its current crisis. And the fourth fundamental political question we have to ask is there an alternative to Eurozone? Or what is the alternative of breaking up the Eurozone? That politically relevant question has not been raised enough. Many European leaders are trying to swim with the waves of populism instead of trying to explain to their citizens what is the cost of breaking up the Eurozone. The first attempt that I've seen last week, I don't know how that funded that is, but UBS, the researchers of UBS, not the traders, have issued a report on what would be the cost of a breakup of Eurozone. And they said if Greece departs alone, in the first single year after departing the Eurozone, they would take a hit between 40 to 50% of GDP. If Germany departs the Eurozone, according to UBS analysts, they would suffer in the first year of departure a hit of between 20 to 25% of GDP, which is an unthinkable number. Even if half of these numbers is true, that is close to civil war in these countries. I'm talking from a position of a former prime minister who had to cut 5% of GDP on the cost side of the budget from one year to another. We survived it, we stabilized the economy, but that was a tremendous strain on our economy. But 15, 20, 25% reduction in GDP, or 40 to 50, is unthinkable. So only economically, from the many economically sound positions or proposals to solve this crisis, only those would work in Greece, Germany, and overall in Europe, which from the political economy point of view, and I agree with the two professors speaking before me, political economy is back with a vengeance now. Only those would work which are looking at these political aspects of what can be considered just for both sides of the debate. I've just drafted an op-ed, I don't know whether I will publish it, on one such solution, which could be first to save the banks by recapitalizing them through turning EFSF into a European Monetary Fund, but then introduce the mechanism of forced exit into the Eurozone for the future, not for the past. A forced exit, a pull out from the Eurozone for those who will become profligate in the future. That would be a guarantee for Germans and other Northern European savers and exporters that in the future they can get rid of those in an orderly and quick way who are free riding at their cost. But on the other hand, this package of solutions should also mean saving Greece and restructuring Greece within the Eurozone, cutting out roughly half of their debt on a conditional basis, agreeing a 10-year restructuring and austerity program, which brings them out of their current stage and brings them back to growth, which would still be very painful. So this sort of solutions can make sense, which help political leaders to explain to their audiences why in the future we will not commit the same mistakes and why there is hope at the end of these solutions. But even if these solutions are found, Europe can only get out of this crisis of integration by going forward. The founding fathers at different foundation points of the European Union, as I explained, could always find suboptimal solutions to the problems of the day. But because they understood those problems are suboptimal, they always found or established structures which behaved like a hook. You cannot pull them out. There is no exit from the Eurozone. There is no exit from Europe, practically. There is only way forward. And they have doomed Europe to find solutions to its crisis, to its problems, always in crisis, under the pressures of crisis. And so I'm convinced Europe will go ahead from this crisis. And if I would need to bet my money, even on rational choice, I would bet on Europe to survive and go ahead with more integration from this crisis. But even if we resolve this crisis of fiscal and financial problems, Europe will immediately bound to face the next major crisis, which will be of European legitimacy. Because if you centralize fiscal policy, then you centralize and raise to the European level the most fundamental issue of politics, the heart of politics, which is how much money you take from the citizens of a country or a region and how much money you give back to other citizens. That is the heart of politics. And if that is raised or controlled or decided to a large extent, increasingly large extent in Europe, then the legitimacy of European policy making has to be raised compared to the current very low participation level. As long as we get there, European leaders have three obligations. We are facing very tough environment in the coming 10 years, major challenges looking way beyond the fiscal crisis of competitiveness and austerity and reform at the same time. But the responsibility of European leaders is threefold. First, they have to make sacrifice as short as possible without making political curves too much and prolonging the crisis. Second, they should avoid making unnecessary sacrifice because there is already enough pain that will come into the system just to solve this problem. But above all, the biggest responsibility of everybody who's in a leading position, decision-making position, is to make all this sacrifice worthwhile. Because there is a big challenge, big risk, whether at the end of this road of sacrifice, there is a better working system which will go up, or whether Europe will unfold and go into the abyss. That is the challenge that we face today. Thank you very much.
Alacevich, and then we're going to collect together our thoughts.
Thank you. Well, I found these interventions all very interesting, and of course, well, I limit my intervention to just a comment to my previous people who spoke before me. There is a recurrent element in what I heard, and of course it's easy to recognize it. Charles Maier mentioned the fact that Eurotopia functioned with no common budget or political authority, and Perry Mehrling underscored the fact that the European Central Bank acted because there is no European treasury acting in Europe. And Gordon Bajnai just said that we are facing a crisis of European integration, and we are witnessing a monetary union, but no fiscal union. And I would like to comment on this, basically to the lack of a common treasury in Europe, and to the fact that this is a political crisis at this point of Europe. I think we should consider that in any case the monetary union was not conceived as the ultimate goal of the process, but rather as an intermediate step toward a stronger and deeper political and economic union of Europe. And the idea behind the monetary union was that the European countries would agree to wear a self-imposed straitjacket which would force them to adopt a common monetary discipline, and this in turn would be the basis for a further step toward political unification. We often hear the remark that the historical peculiarity of Europe and of the euro is that we have a single currency without having a single state. I think that, well, I often hear this remark with the implicit idea or hope that the political single entity will follow soon. And in other words, I think that it was pretty clear that the monetary union alone would be untenable over a long period unless a political union stronger than we had would be put in place. In this sense, we could consider the process of establishing a monetary union as an unbalancing step that at the same time forces Europe to make another step on the political side to remain standing. And I would like to discuss this through the lens of Albert Hirschman's analysis of processes of economic and political development. Albert Hirschman in the 50s proposed an analysis of economic development as fundamentally unbalanced, where specific changes or innovation at the firm, sectoral, or regional level of an economy would create a critical situation that would force further changes in the economic system. And for Hirschman, this was like a series of linkages that would move ahead this process of economic development through a series of imbalances. And this model became pretty famous among economists, and not only, it was used also in political sciences and in the social sciences. Hirschman discussed this model in the 50s, and then he discussed it again with regards to Europe in the 70s and in the 80s. But it's interesting that in the 50s, while Hirschman was discussing this about economic development in less developed countries, Ernst Haas in Europe was proposing similar consideration about the process of European unification. The Treaty of Rome had been signed just 1 year before, in 1957. And Haas spoke, instead of linkages, of spillover effects, focusing on the new economic institutions that had been established by the Treaty of Rome, such as the Euratom or the Common Market, and predicted, now I'm quoting him, that the growth of a political community can be safely projected from the work of these new economic institutions. He also said, he also wrote that it would be inconceivable that the trade liberalization among European countries would go on for long without harmonization of general economic policies spilling over into other economic and political fields in Europe, and concluded, I'm quoting again, the spillover may make a political community of Europe, in fact, even before the end of the liberalization process. Again, I think that Haas was proposing something very similar to that unbalanced process analyzed by Hirschman, in the fact that critical tensions arising from an economic, from the process of economic unification would force further progress in the process of political unification of the country. I think as a matter of, well, during the 60s, the process of unification slowed down, but for example, at the end of the 70s, the establishment of the European monetary system could be read as a reaction to the stagnation of growth, the inflation, and the rise in unemployment in Europe. So there is, again, a link on that. I would just like to make a question to our speakers, because I think these models, these patterns, are useful to analyze the process of unification in Europe for the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. I'm wondering if you think they can be useful today. If they are also, in a sense, an optimistic analysis, because from a crisis and imbalances, they predict that we would reach further and better equilibria. And I have a second question just related to this, because after all, these patterns work if we have actors that are able to make the necessary steps to go beyond a situation of crisis and disequilibrium to reach a deeper, and not just economic and monetary, but also political union of Europe. And I wonder if you think that we have now in Europe a strong enough, a political leadership that is strong enough and visionary enough and credible enough to move ahead of the curve, as you say, and bring Europe out of this economic and, as I said, I think also political crisis. And that's it for my comments, because I think we needed to give also space to the audience. So thank you.